Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Todd Embley, and I am the host and executive producer of the Negotiation Podcast, and I'm excited to be moderating this fantastic webinar on winning with cloud computing in China. I'm going to be joined today by two special guests. First, I'd like to introduce Hao Lin, who is joining us from San Francisco. Hao is the head of channel and strategic initiatives at Alibaba Cloud. For those who aren't aware, Alibaba Cloud is a leading cloud computing platform that provides small, medium, and enterprise organizations with cloud solutions across a variety of sectors. Hao, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John.
And out of Vancouver, we are joined by Joseph Cook, who is the president of WPIC Marketing and Technologies. WPIC is a tech consultancy with co-head offices in Vancouver and Beijing, and they help global businesses expand into China and Japan through data analytics, e-commerce solutions, digital marketing, and much, much more. Joseph, thank you very much for jumping on here.
Thanks, Todd. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, right off the top, we do want to encourage everybody, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask of our guests, please go ahead and submit those. We do have people on the back end that will be collecting those, and we will be formulating some of the top questions and bringing those forward at the end when we get into the Q&A section of this. So just to kick things off, why don't you guys describe for the audience at a high level what the opportunity is for global brands in China? Maybe I'll throw that over to Joseph first.
Sure. Thanks, Todd. Pleasure to be here today. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Well, when we look at the opportunity, we can trace a trajectory, back a half a dozen years in China, where we've seen the, internet citizen rate, go from, 300-400 million skyrocket up to, give or take a billion, depending on which data you look at. So, it's a massive internet market. It's the most massive internet market in the world. Overlay that with some of the details and metrics we have around the quantitative value of this market as well. What we see from straight e-commerce transactions, we see north of $1 trillion US in annual GMV for online purchases. And that doesn't even take into account those that research and make purchasing decisions online, but then take the purchase offline. So it's an incredibly massive, influential, and very important internet in the world to be focused on. However, we're challenged with this firewall that surrounds the market, and that firewall can cause all sorts of complexity for global organizations who wish to sell in, grow their market, and enter the market via the web. The importance of understanding what that firewall does, can't be overstated. And this is why, we want to talk about cloud solutions inside the market, the importance of understanding what that is, and ways to mitigate the penalties that the firewall will provide to you.
Okay, Hao, same question. I'll toss it over to you. Do you want to maybe give the audience a look into what the opportunity is for global brands in China?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think Joseph really provided a very comprehensive answer. I can only try to add on to what Joseph said, but just like Joseph said, it's a very, very large market, and we really haven't gotten to even realizing half of the total market yet. A ton of internet users, a ton of mobile users, and because of the unique environment, both the habits from the consumers, the widely available and adopted mobile payments, and all sorts of different commerce motions, that have happened right in front of our eyes, in many ways, eclipsing, what's happened in the Western world. It really is a great opportunity for global brands to start capturing some of these, newly, how do I say this? All of a sudden, a very booming middle class, and their consumption habits and their consumption targets. Now, one of the welcoming things, for companies from the Americas or from the Western world is that they love quality goods, right? So they often, seek out to companies and brands from the Americas because they perceive that, companies from this side usually equate to quality goods. So, we really have this buyers wanting to buy and seller wanting to sell situation. And just like Joseph said, we just need to make sure that we can be well prepared to enter this market, play the way that this market needs to be played, and then maximize the opportunity for the China market. And that includes, technology. Joseph talked about the firewall, among other things that we really should be more prepared about, in order to truly capture this booming market.
Okay, so Hao, let's continue on with that. You were talking about being more prepared. What's the process that brands need to undertake in order to fully realize this opportunity?
Well, that's a great question. I think, first of all, we have to look at China not just as another market. I think this is probably, based on my experiences dealing with global brands, this is probably the biggest misnomer, in terms of trying to get a bigger share of the China market. So a lot of the companies I deal with, they try to leverage the strategy they have globally, whether it's a technology strategy, or it's a business expansion strategy, or it's a customer acquisition strategy. They try to leverage the global strategy and simply make that the China strategy. I would say that is probably the number one thing that the global brands should get over, and really have a China for China strategy. And once we got that out of the way, once you agree that China requires a different strategy in order to be successful for global brands, then you can start taking a look at all different aspects of the business environment, the political environment, the technology environment, among others. There are a lot of different elements at play that are very, very different from them of the Western world. So I'll give an example. Do you know that of the e-commerce transactions that Joseph was speaking about, right? And China does have the largest e-commerce market globally. Do you know that 90% of all transactions take place on mobile? So I'll tell you this, I work for Alibaba, and I still purchase goods from Amazon.com on my laptop. I prefer that, right? This is a very, very big difference between the consumer habits of China and the rest of the world, and this is, I'm hoping, one of the things that can illustrate China is a different market, and in order to fully capture, maximize your opportunity in China, you got to do things differently. And I would say that's the number one advice, I would have for brands in order to maximize their China opportunity, is to have a strategy for China, and not have it be just, a part of your global strategy.
Okay, thanks, Hao. Joseph, what are the first steps in the process of brands realizing this opportunity in China?
Well, let's take a step back. Let's look at the market as a whole, right? So, you have your obvious big four cities: Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou. This is typically referred to as the first tier cities. You have other concepts in China where you talk about the China 50 or second tier cities, right? The China 50 might be the next 50 biggest cities inside China. There's data to, talk about, there's 100, 102, 105 cities in China, all with 100 million people plus. The likelihood that brands and organizations in the US or globally don't know the names of these cities or where they're located is pretty high, right? And so, you think about strategies of how to approach the market for brick and mortar, signing distributors, going kind of classic international expansion methodology is where you would, sign one distributor, maybe two, cut the market up geographically into two parts, north, south, or east and west, let distributors take it, or, invest in some brick and mortar in your first tier cities. It's one thing to, establish, a flagship retail outlet, in, Nanjinglu in Shanghai, right, where you're going to get a lot of foot traffic. But really, you're talking about scratching the surface of maybe, basis points of that actual market, right? The real market, how touched on the rising middle class, the real market sits inside these second tier cities, right? Cities like Chongqing with over 30 million people in them, Jinan, Nanjing, Suzhou, cities that, global companies rarely go to, rarely invest in. And you have this hunger, of users and customers inside these cities and territories, with a thirst for, foreign brands, high quality products, just like how outlined. And how are they accessing this information? How are they learning about these brands? And how, most importantly, are they making these purchases, right? It's happening through web, it's happening through digital, primarily it's happening through mobile, right? I think there was news that had just come out about, the largest 5G network now being inside China. This is obviously going to support the thesis that Hao just outlaid about mobility, right? Which is going to touch, the majority of that country fairly soon. They're looking at 850 million people having access to this 5G network inside China. So, as you said, and your question was, what's the first step to approaching this? Well, I think the first step is probably to understand what the market makeup really is, right? It's diversified, it's spread across a huge geography, but it's largely centralized inside mobile and inside web, right? So although it's large and complex and spread out, the gateway into it really is fairly straightforward. You can put this into one page, right? Through mobile, through digital, through the web, through good IT. And these things then all boil down to accessing the Chinese internet, which is its own internet, which is then powered by the cloud. And in this case, talking about Alibaba Cloud is a perfect example of taking, best in class infrastructure to access the world's largest internet purchasing e-commerce market. The approaches are fairly straightforward, right? We acquire a local domain, a .cn rather than a .com. We register that domain to acquire an ICP license. This is essentially a license plate for a domain to allow content to be hosted inside China, right? We register this domain with the Ministry of Information, the body that oversees and regulates the web inside China. Once we've done that, we can then open up hosting on the cloud inside China. Once we've done that, then we can push content in there. So it's really a 3, 4, 5-step process, which is a fairly light lift, to be able to do that. There's some complexity around compliance and regulation and approvals and licensing and things like that. But there's some pretty straightforward ways to lower that bar and mitigate that general red tape.
Okay, thanks, Joseph. Maybe speak a little bit to the sort of opportunities having a dedicated .cn. You mentioned the .com, then going to the .cn and the ICP. Getting that .cn inside the market, what does that do for opening up the market for a brand? What does the world look like from the lens of a company that's using these technologies we're discussing versus those who are not?
Yeah, well, once you have a .cn and you're hosted inside the market, then you're in the game, right? Now you can start rolling out tactics and methodology, content strategies, marketing strategies, various digital strategies inside the market to now actually go after it. You can play ball in the game, right? If you're not localized via domain, via ICP, via getting inside the Chinese cloud network, then you're subject to whatever's going on a macro level. And I'll give you some examples, right? So, the firewall around, China's a bit of a black box. We test, we measure, we analyze, we pull data, we get some ideas of the consequences of what the firewall really does. And we get some clues and some patterns, right? Some patterns that we've been able to discover is that, the firewall throttles non-Chinese web traffic on a daily basis. This typically happens late afternoon into the evening when Chinese internet traffic goes into its peak performance modes, right? So, let's stick with the suggestion that at the low end, there's 850 million people online in China. That requires a lot of metal and a lot of networking and a lot of fiber to be able to support that, right? When we hit max demand online inside China at that period of time, the firewall seems to prioritize domestic traffic that sits on local domains, that has an ICP, that's gone through the approval processes for content delivery inside the market, right? So for brands that sit on a .com/CN, use some kind of a global CDN, that they think can push Chinese language pages into China, what happens when the throttling starts to fire up in the evening when you most want to be live inside China is that traffic starts to get slowed down and sometimes fully blocked. And this is just a nature of capacity inside the market, right? Really nothing else. So, trying to outsmart the firewall by mitigating, doing the right thing, by maybe trying to cut a corner by going on a CDN really isn't going to get the result. And we have countless examples of brands trying to do that. It's just not going to get the result that one wants, right? So, doing the .cn route and taking that lift on, that extra little bit of effort, that last mile of tech work, all of a sudden now changes your world for now being able to participate in the game and go after some of that share of wallet, which is north of $1 trillion US annually. So it's a significant, game changer, we think, for organizations.
How do you want to jump on that as well? Maybe you have a different perspective on the value of a dedicated .cn.
Yeah, maybe from going away from a pure performance perspective, which Joseph outlined extremely well. It's as part of the Cybersecurity Law, from the Chinese government that was implemented at the beginning of 2018. It's now required for a foreign company when they want to own a domain name in China, they need to register it with a Chinese registrar. So let me tell you what that means. You can no longer go buy a domain name from GoDaddy and then try to apply for an ICP with it. Okay, so maybe I can speak to it a little bit more technically. You might or might not need to get a .cn. It could be whatever else, but it definitely cannot be your global site. So the intent behind this cybersecurity law and its stipulation on ICP is to ensure that global companies have a China-specific site. So by what Joseph just talked about, which was extremely detailed, not only does it have significant performance advantages by having a .cn with ICP, but it is now also compliant. And the Chinese government has every right to shut down a non-compliant website and web domain at moment's notice. And this has happened to some of the largest brands in the world. So I would say that, it's extremely important as you consider, getting a web presence for China, that, you want to make sure that, you can do everything in your power. And again, going back to my, China for China strategy, to really go with a solution that would not only be performant, but compliant. And now I'd like to take maybe a lighter angle, on this issue. I personally met with an outdoor sporting apparel brand based out of Vancouver. This was about a year and a half ago, and they sell in China. They're a very popular brand in China, and they go through distributors for the most part. And what happened was I asked them about their website performance, and it's not great, but it's doable. We get by. So when I went to China, and I remember very vividly, I was sitting in a Marriott hotel in Shanghai, and I pulled up their website, and I took a video clip of it and sent it to them. The video clip was a minute and a half long. It took over a minute to pull up their website in Shanghai. Right. So a lot of times, you might feel that, the performance is acceptable, or you're not hearing a lot of complaints, from the Americans, but in fact, it is extremely bad. And the reason why you don't hear about them is because customers simply just go elsewhere. There are too many choices, for consumers and on the digital presence of different brands, and they just simply go elsewhere. So, this is not an issue to take lightly, and it's a very important issue. Again, Joseph outlined with a lot of detail. That was very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the speed, almost the frenetic nature of the attention of the Chinese consumer. So maybe I'll let you continue a little bit and talk about the types of technologies that different brands need to leverage given this information.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So speed's only one thing. One thing I would tell you is that, the Chinese consumers are very spoiled with the availability of different type of contents. Even if we strictly take a look at, where and what they're able to shop on their mobile phone for, right? They're extremely impatient which is why, Alibaba has spent billions of dollars literally in building a very robust and fully optimized backbone for China, because Taobao and Tmall, these core businesses of Alibaba, depend on the ability to be able to have our consumers get to the content that we want to push to them, literally a moment's notice. So speed is one thing. People are impatient. There are a lot of choices. And if you're slow, if it takes more than a second, people are going to go away. The second thing is the appropriate and the applicability of the content. So, it's extremely important in China to be able to push relevant content to the consumer demographics group that you're targeting. Because and this goes into how China is a very different consumer market. So, in the Western world, we have, imagine, a 20-something or 30-something daily lives, right? You have Facebook, you have Twitter, you have Google, you have YouTube, you have Instagram, you have Reddit, among others, right? And all these different companies, have their own different ecosystems. And, they certainly don't share the data across different ecosystems. In China, if you look at it, across commerce, Alibaba certainly dominates. And then you have Weibo, and then you have, which is, a Twitter in China. And then you have, Alipay, which is the dominant mobile payment, in China. And then you have Ali Movies, you have Ali Sports. So there are probably one or two companies that each of them has operating entities that occupy people's daily lives. So I can easily say that Alibaba is a very big part of a consumer's daily life, right? And then that, in addition to the fact that everything is on mobile, so all of a sudden you have all these ecosystem products, all interacting with the same user on the mobile phone. And then in China, getting a mobile phone isn't so easy. You got to go through real name registration, right? Here, I can go to an AT&T store, or I can go to a tele store, and then I can get a burner phone. And it's not that easy to accurately identify the end user. But in China, it's different. The companies and the government know exactly who is behind what mobile number. So when you combine these characteristics, companies have started to take advantage of the fact that you're able to get a very, very accurate profile of your customer. So what we call in the Western world the customer 360. In China, you can get pretty damn close, right? So what does that mean for brands wanting to enter China? Your competition has a very good profile of their target demographic, and if you don't, you're pushing out less relevant or even irrelevant contents, and you will be discarded, right? So that's one thing that is very critical for brands entering China, is that you are encountering competitions doing things that you didn't think was possible, and it is possible in China. So what you have to do is you have to really understand the landscape and understand the technologies available to take advantage of the landscape. And that's what, together with Alibaba Cloud and WPIC, that's what we can do for these brands entering the market. Okay. So that was hopefully a long answer to your question, Tom.
But it was good. It was good. Thank you very much. Just before we get to the next one, and I'm going to ask Joseph the same thing, I just want to remind all our listeners and attendees to please keep the questions coming in. We're seeing some really good stuff come in, so appreciate that. I think Hao and Joseph, you guys are inspiring some very intelligent questions, so that's great. Joseph, why don't you jump on that as well? Talk a little bit about how the speed of China's consumers are affecting what type of technologies different brands need to be leveraging.
Sure. I mean, obviously how addressed it, across a wide range of relevant points in there. From where we sit, we activate, brands on the cloud, on Alibaba Cloud. We integrate them, through the firewall in whatever way they need to. We'll connect databases and technologies and ERP systems to speak to one another between China and, whether it's the US or Europe or other places where they're located. And help IT offices and CTO teams to, deploy inside the market. The types of things, that we typically see that are, important to organizations as they're, rolling out inside the market is they want to be able to, roll out, online inside China, obviously participate in the market. They're desperate for information. They're desperate for analytics. The market's always been a little bit challenging to pull real data out of. So, when an organization deploys, inside Alibaba Cloud and they get some robust, analytics programs built into that, it allows them to understand the pace at which the market moves. And as they adopt new technologies, you have the leaders inside the market, you have the mainstream channels, but, new channels are popping up quickly. And if you're not in the game, if you're not measuring that data, it becomes really challenging to understand how the consumer market shifts, how, a particular post, that goes viral on WeChat could be something that, a really prominent brand out of the US has just no visibility into. And that viral activity online, WeChat, in China could really shift a market to pivot to a new channel, a new platform. There could be, 300 million, US dollars of GMV that gets generated out of a ripple effect of behaviors out of something like that. And, unless you're on the ground, participating, measuring, ready to move quickly, a lot of foreign brands are really going to miss out on that. And we're seeing that in the data, especially coming, freshly out of 11/11 here, really strong performance from a lot of local brands and a lot of local organizations inside China, who by default understand that and have their ear to the track, right, to see where the pace of change goes. So that's really important. Another thing that we typically deal with from where we sit is when, you're working with global organizations and hypothetically they use something like Salesforce or Marketo for marketing automation, or they use Salesforce for their CRM, and managing customer and client data. Well, something like Salesforce that sits on a global cloud, they don't have pods inside China. There are issues around their compliance inside the market. So, a brand that tries to push via their .com, and their global experience into China to, enable marketing automation or have their CRM, function for them and be useful for them inside China, we start to see these breakdowns inside the market. And so not only does it a matter of, pushing, inside of, a dedicated Chinese domain with an ICP and hosting inside the market, but then you get to all the next layers of technologies that just aren't going to stand up well inside the market. And then with that, you're going to get all sorts of data loss, which is, again, not going to enable you to participate and manage the fast moving pace of the market online inside China, thus just propelling your success downward, right? At the end of the day, you'll have a CIO's office, sitting in, Midwest US looking at the data from China and the performance and saying, what's the big deal with the market? We're not seeing it. Well, really what they're not seeing is the path to success. And they're not really being able to read the tea leaves in the market, right? That help them understand, okay, if we made some shifts to our procedure, then we're going to be able to participate, in some of the success and leverage this fast moving, environment that you stated.
We're going to move now to Singles Day discussion, move into the next phase of this. And maybe I'll come back to you. What are some of the broader trends that you're seeing among Chinese consumers this year? How is technology impacting that?
Sure. Well, we have the run up to Singles Day. We have the run up to 11/11. Everybody knows what this is. And this was, just a gift from Alibaba to the world to say, come and liquidate inside China, right? I think one of the trends that we've seen this year is, as opposed to other years, traditionally what you've seen is you roll into Singles Day being November 11th is you start to see a lull in transactions roughly about a month in advance of that. So in September, we have the 9/9, the September 9th Shopping Day Festival, which can be extraordinarily successful. The remainder of September runs fairly normal. And then in October, we start to see things slow down. And I think this has always been a combination of, brands putting a lot of their bandwidth to preparing for 11/11, as well as potential consumers holding off on those purchases until the sales and promotions start to come out and get released. What we saw this year was we saw no dip in October. So we came out of the September 9th 9/9 festival really strong, September being really strong, and continuing that trend right through into October with traffic, demand, inquiries, sales, basket activity, all continuing the upward trajectory throughout the year, which was a major change this year. Now that we've had, the pre-sales come in and performance in and around 11/11 start to, show its colors, it was a really, really strong performance coming out of it. And we got the first indicators coming through in pre-sale where we started to see a lot of baskets fill up and customers lay out those deposits for those particular purchases. So we've been really thrilled this year with what we've seen. We've been really thrilled with what we've seen, throughout October as well. It's really encouraging and getting everybody really excited to continue to push forward for a really successful Q4 and an overall really successful 2019.
What are typically some of the winning tactics that brands are using to succeed on 11/11, and then broadly just across China in general?
That's a good question. So I think really is to, in order to, the most successful vendors that I've seen on Singles Day, and, I have, one that I call my customer. They consistently have been over the last couple of years, the top 5 brands of all brands, not just foreign brands, but all brands on Tmall on Singles Day, is that they engage the Chinese consumers through a process of gamification. So what does that mean? As you know, the Chinese people like to interact, with their mobile phones, and the Chinese people also love games in general, right? So it's no secret that Alibaba has long been doing game shows, similar to what would be a New Year's Eve party sort of thing on TV, the program. Alibaba has done game shows through the mobile phone to get their consumers to interact with them for Singles Day. Now, the most successful brands that I've seen have also adopted this tactic, and they try to engage their consumers right up to Singles Day. Literally when the clock strikes 12 or 12 o'clock and 1 second, and that's when the consumers are ready and they're in the mindset and they're making the purchases of the products from the brands that they've been engaged with. So that's one tactic that I've really seen take off for some of the top brands that have done well on Singles Day, is to keep their attention, stay engaged with them, using gamification so that the consumers are able to have fun, and then when they do, they tend to spend money.
Okay, Joseph, over to you. As we're just finishing 11/11 Singles Day this week, can you speak a bit about some of the trends that you saw for this festival?
Yeah, I mean, it's no surprise that we saw, transaction volume up. We saw basket size up. And we saw overall turnover up across a multitude of sectors: apparel, footwear, outdoor, cosmetics, topical skin, personal care, children's, etc. Everybody was up, which is great, obviously, right? This is what the brands are going to want to experience. And we weren't subject to, super heavy discounts either to drive that, which again is so encouraging. So this provides all sorts of opportunity and runway for brands to, kind of exploit this reality inside the market. Something that we've seen, and this supports, what Hao is talking about in terms of successful strategies he's seen in his recommendations, is we have seen, and we saw it this year, and we're continuing to see this growing trend, is a major decentralization of web behavior inside the market. So, consumers are seeking intel and content and data from a multitude of sources to validate and verify before they make a purchase. Not much different than what we see in the West, right? As users go through the purchasing hierarchy through that funnel, we start to see, awareness and conviction, and preference, get triggered at different stages of the funnel. And we're using different channels to be able to amplify that, right? Whether you're pushing to, a content platform, a forum, a portal, a BBS, believe it or not, which are still hugely popular inside the market. Social and WeChat plays a role at some point in the process. Ads and content and customer service inside Tmall plays a role at some point, of course. But we're seeing this real large decentralization, where really supports our long-standing, decade-long thesis, where we are such fans of, this .cn strategy, .cn being a metaphor for a Chinese website hosted inside the market. Because with the decentralization, you need some repository to collect the intel and the data, to feed back to decision makers, per your earlier question. So we can use, a China hosted site in some way, load it up with an analytics measurement tool to use that to shoot out and push content out there in the market, refer users back to the site, use something like an OAuth 2.0 protocol to get people, automatically signed in and logged in and following, a social channel, which pushes them to the social channel and then back to the site, using API connectivity, with Tmall to then shoot them from a product page on a site over to Tmall and then back and back and back and forth until finally they make the purchase. So really using all of these channels, basically anchored in a .cn, cloud experience, just as how it says, to command the attention, to keep the consumer eyeball on you and only you, right from initial discovery through to end purchase. And based on your sector, and product and price point, that could be a 10-minute journey, or that could be a 10-day journey, or that could be a 10-month journey, depending on what it is, right? So, this has been the trend that we've seen growing over the years. It's stayed true, ever since even Weibo came online many years ago, through to now this e-commerce revolution, largely driven by Alibaba and Tmall.
Thanks for that, Joseph. Okay, guys, we're going to go to some questions from the audience now. And how maybe I'll jump over to you. We've discussed being prepared to do business in China. But as we've seen, 11/11 is a totally different story. They call it Black Friday on steroids. So can you talk a little bit about what's required from a brand to be prepared for this, special time? And in order to participate, what do they need to do to be prepared just for being able to offer deals on 11/11?
Well, I think, what is cool about 11/11 and frankly Alibaba's platform is that, for the most part, the infrastructure needs, on the e-commerce itself is taken care of for you, right? So if you're setting up a shop on Tmall and, you don't really need to worry about, the infrastructure needs for 11/11 because it is tremendous, right? Last year, 2018, since the numbers this year haven't been finalized, 2018, the number was 31 billion, the first billion which was done in the first 55 seconds, right? So just imagine the infrastructure needs that you don't have to worry about. Now, it doesn't mean that because the e-commerce infrastructure burden doesn't fall on the brands, it doesn't mean that you don't need to be prepared for your own digital presence and the type of traffic that a successful 11/11 could bring, right? So, like we have talked about, during this webinar, that having a .cn, having the right infrastructure, for the Chinese consumers, having the right CDN to be able to serve consumers in the second and third tier cities, like Joseph said earlier, having the right security measures, right? China remains one of the most active markets for DDoS attacks for any public-facing web presence. Having the right business level security. Do you know that if you had a consumer make a comment on your digital presence, whether it's a mobile app or it's a website, and that comment happens to be politically sensitive, that you're on the hook for that, right? We've seen, like I said earlier, we've seen some of the largest brands in the world have their website shut down by the Chinese government because of, the carelessness, in handling information that is on their digital presence, right? So these are all the steps, almost like a checklist, that you got to be able to, step through and make sure that, every one of the boxes is checked before you can, feel confident in, serving the right content, which is, like I said earlier, it's of the most important, one of the most important things in order to be successful in China is serving the relevant content, right? So, with Alibaba Cloud and with WPIC, this is the type of value that we can bring. We can help you through the checklist.
All right, Joseph, I want to come back to you and give you the opportunity, because I know you'll have some brilliant answers for this. So talk a little bit about, the 1111, what's required from a brand in order to participate, and how can they make sure that they're prepared for everything that's special and monstrous about 1111.
Sure, thanks. Well, I think, communication with the platform is critical. Hao mentioned that, really the platform does the lift, and they're the ones that are doing all the work, which is great. So, what can you do to be a good steward of that, as a brand? Early communication, really strong relationships with your shower or your category manager. For example, if you're in, footwear, right? Communicating early with the category managers for footwear, and communicating early, right? Coming out of 618, June 18th, the second biggest sales festival on the market, coming out of that, communicating with, the category manager of footwear, for example, sharing your experiences about what happened in June, sharing some initial plans about what you want to do, getting buy-in from the brand. So, we're a TP, we operate stores. Our methodology is not, for us to go, into Hangzhou to the category manager at Alibaba and say, here's what we want to do for 1111. Our methodology might be more to grab our client from the US, plan a trip to China in the summer or September, go meet with Alibaba, sit down, get in a room for a couple hours, get on the whiteboard, talk about what the brand wants to do, ask Alibaba how they're going to support you, talk about commitment. We'll bring a bunch of data to the table and strategies and things like this, and really try and sort of level jump compared to our competitive set to say, we're locked, loaded, totally prepared to be as aggressive as possible to win our category. And the response from Alibaba is really, really strong. They're really receptive to that kind of attitude if you're legitimately prepared to come in and support them on the lift. So this, out of the gate is what one needs to do, I think, to get themselves really prepared. But ultimately, it comes back to the brand to say, what do you want to do? What do you want to achieve here? How big of a day, how big of a sales festival do you want? That's sort of the most important question to answer. Once we answer that, then you apply, the appropriate strategy, starting with at the high end, walking through, I stated there around, preparing to go in and, have meetings and have workshops with them, down through to the other side, which, might just be, spinning up some campaigns, nominating 3 or 4 really hot products, putting a light 10% discount on it, and then, running the standard program, inside the ecosystem.
All right. Hal, Joseph, can't thank you both enough. I think we're going to have to put a bow on it here now. Thank you very much for coming in. Thank you to our audience and everybody for listening. Really appreciate you jumping on here. Hope you found it as valuable as I did. And I just want to encourage everybody to keep sending in their questions. We're going to try to get to those offline one by one. And if you want to take advantage of the QR codes that you're probably seeing on your screen right now, feel free to scan those and reach out and connect with us. Thanks again very much for coming on the webinar today. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our audience. Have a great day, everybody.